Hello everyone, this is Professor Hasselman in History 104 online, and today we're going to talk about the failure of the polis and the rise of Alexander and Hellenistic Greece, the ancient Greece of Alexander and those who followed right before the arrival of the Romans on the scene and the development of the Roman Empire. Now, suffice it to say that the 4th century BCE, the period after the Peloponnesian War, was an extremely difficult period for the Greek world. Now, eventually the Greek world fell to the Macedonians to the north. Now, the 4th century was a terribly difficult time for the Greek world, but the difficulties were not unprecedented. During the Persian Wars, there were quarrels over strategy, and some Greek cities, Medized, went over to the enemy. Now, during the Peloponnesian Wars, most of the Greek world was dragged into the battle. Brutality became a way of life. Sparta won and threw out the Athenian democracy, but the 30 tyrants quickly discredited themselves and a more moderate democracy was restored. Now, to finish off the war against the sea-wise Athenians, the Spartan landlubbers turned to Persia, the ancient enemy. Now, for a generation, the Spartans, aided by Persia, which was really pulling the strings, dominated the Greek world. The Thebans then pulled together an alliance to put an end to Spartan rule and establish a hegemony, or a dominance, for about a decade. So we had the Spartans overthrowing the Athenians, and then the Thebans coming in next, from Thebes. The Athenians now recreated a smaller version of their former empire and liberated Greece from Thebes. Now, meanwhile, to the north, the Macedonian storm cloud was gathering force. Now, the Macedonians were a tough people whom the Greeks called barbarians. Essentially, the word barbarians means babblers, or those who babble, people who do not speak Greek. Now, Macedon's kings were, however, accomplished rulers. By conquering important silver mines, they secured access to financial resources. Philip II, who lived from about 382 to 336 BCE, was a particularly accomplished soldier, a reasonably cultivated man. He hired Aristotle to tutor his son, after all, and ambitious. Meanwhile, in the Greek world, idealized states and pan-Hellenism were taking hold. Aristotle called man a political animal. He meant a being who naturally lives in a polis. But he knew perfectly well that polis had failed badly. He and his pupil studied 158 of them. Now, he imagined an ideal state governed by an oligarchy of aristocrats. So, in other words, an oligarchy is ruled by a few, and of course, ruled by the best. So, aristocrats are those who are higher in society, like the elites, and the oligarchy means ruled by the few. So, this is how Aristotle saw government should be run. Now, it's not so clear how this could come into being. Plato imagined his ideal republic, the ideal republic where kings would be philosophers and philosophers would be kings. And by the end of his life, he gave up on this ideal and settled for a very small state where a carefully chosen few saw to the implementation of the laws. So when we often think of ancient Greece as very democratic, there was some elitism thrown in there as well. Now, Isocrates, who lived from 436 to 338 BCE, gave rise to Pan-Hellenism, literally meaning all Greekism. His dream was that all of Greece would unite under Athens and Sparta to undertake a crusade against Persia. Now, he imagined that the Greeks had once been united. Then, realizing that the Greeks would not bow to one of their own, he tried to persuade people to unite under Philip of Macedon. Now, meanwhile, Demosthenes, who lived from 384 to 322 BCE, Greece's indeed antiquity's greatest orator, raised his voice in defense of the autonomy of the polis. So this is Demosthenes. But he also would have wished for a war against Persia. He delivered 4 Philippics against Philip and saw Macedon as such a threat to Greek liberty that he actually entertained the idea of allying with the Persians against the Macedonians. Now, amidst the welter of wars, alliances, and idealistic dreaming, Philip attacked. At Chaeronea in 338, Philip's army won a decisive victory over the Greeks. The attacking wing was led by Philip's 18-year-old son, Alexander. Philip created a league with himself as its head to govern Greece, and he began making preparations to attack Persia. Now, this might have been his own idea, or it might have been suggested to him by the Greeks. In 336, Philip was murdered in a palace intrigue, the outlines of which are still not clear to this day. After some work to patch up relations with his father's supporters, Alexander became king. Now, Alexander, who lived from 356 to 323 BCE, is an enigmatic figure. Large, handsome, athletic, intelligent, charismatic, but also ruthless and immeasurably ambitious. He was ideologically clever. He depicted his war against Persia as a crusade to even the account for a long-ago Persian attack on Greece. But he was using this as a cover for sheer imperialism. He also used his campaigns as a way to distract and reward the Macedonian nobles, who might have turned against him at any moment. Now, once again, remember that Alexander was not Greek, he was Macedonian from the north. Still, one should not minimize the extent of Alexander's military achievement. With a force no larger than 35,000 men, he conquered the Persian Empire, marched beyond it into Central Asia and northern India. His tactics and personal courage were important, but so too was his attention to material and supply lines. Scholars have long thought that Alexander was cosmopolitan, that he fostered a kind of multicultural world. He incorporated foreigners into his command structure, he married an Asian princess, and he promoted the study of the regions he conquered. Now, Alexander died rather early, shortly before his 33rd birthday, probably of malaria, while conquering his empire. He left no institutions in place and no plans as far as we know. Now, the question of what he might have done had he lived longer still remains open. Alexander unintentionally inaugurated what we call the Hellenistic world. This was a period when Greek values and culture would dominate the Mediterranean basin on a grand scale, and this is like the other colonizing and imperializing ventures that we've already encountered. The spreading of a culture in this way played a decisive role in pouring the foundations for a Western civilization with deep Greek roots, instead of a Greek civilization that passed into oblivion. So let's talk a little bit about this Hellenistic world. Now, this is a world that we generally date from the death of Alexander in 323 BCE until the Battle of Actium, when the Romans defeated the last of the great Hellenistic rulers in 31 BCE. So running from about 323 BCE, the death of Alexander, to the defeat at the Battle of Actium by the Romans in 31 BCE. So nearly a 300-year period known as the Hellenistic world. Now, Hellenistic is the name given to the period, like I said, from the death of Alexander to the Roman triumph in the Mediterranean. And the name is meant to distinguish between Hellenic proper and Hellenic influenced. Now, Greek became koine. Greek art dominated influence. Greek philosophy regnant but revised. And this is a world of empires and kingdoms, not of the polis or poles. Now, on Alexander's death, his leading generals carved up his vast realm. Antigonos, his descendants are called the Antigonids, took Macedon and the Balkans. Gradually, the Greek lands broke away into a league of their own under nominal Antigonid supervision. In the western Balkans, the kingdom of Epirus emerged. We will meet the inhabitants again as enemies of Rome. Now, Syria, Palestine, northern Mesopotamia, and southern Anatolia fell to the Seleucids. Now, mostly named Seleucus and Antiochus, the Seleucids turn up in the last books of the Hebrew Bible. Judas Maccabeus revolted against them. They shared rule in Anatolia, which is present-day Turkey, with Pergamum. Now, Egypt fell to the Ptolemies, whose last ruler was Cleopatra, and these kingdoms warred against and allied with one another repeatedly until the Romans conquered them one by one. It is the cultural, not specifically this political that we've talked about, history of the Hellenistic world, that is interesting and important. So regardless of who ruled what and where they ruled and all these things, what's more important is the cultural aspect. The Hellenistic world was one of vast wealth, easy movements of people, and rapid cultural dissemination, as well as genuine cosmopolitanism. Now this is the idea that the city is, or the region is made up of lots of different cultural groups. Now, developments in Alexandria are revealing. The city was founded by Alexander. He founded more than 20. It had 500,000 people by about 250 BCE and 1 million by 50 BCE. The scholars in its museum, that is, house of the muses, or academy of all the branches of knowledge, were learned and professional, not great civic figures as in the polis. So it was more on education and knowledge rather than the ability to rule. Culture was increasingly an object of study, not a part of daily life and debate. Learned elitist scholars began to develop the ideas of a literary canon, of normative texts, of critically defined tastes and standards. Here we see for the first time the ivory tower intellectual. This opened the gap characterized by C.P. Snow in his book The Two Cultures, insofar as many Alexandrians were scientists, while philosophers worked elsewhere. Hence, the division between the arts and sciences, instead of the integration that had been the ideal of the academy and the lyceum. So we have this separation between sciences and philosophy. The Hellenistic world was a time of important scientific breakthroughs. Euclid, who lived around 300, formulated the rules of geometry. Archimedes, also in the 3rd century BCE, created all sorts of gadgets and advanced experimental sciences. Aristarchus, who lived in around 275 BCE, formulated the heliocentric theory, the idea that the sun is the center of the universe. Eratosthenes, around 225 BCE, calculated the circumference of the Earth, and Ptolemy, who lived around 127 to 58 BCE, systemized astronomical information, created a theory of the motion of the planets and the moon, and added a crucial mathematical element to astronomical theory. So several different scientists, Euclid or mathematics, Euclid, Archimedes, Ptolemy, lived during this time period. Now the Hellenistic world also spawned new literary forms. Apollonius, who around 295 BCE, wrote Argonautica, a work on an epic scale, but not an epic, an adventure story and a love story. Jason and his Argonauts go in search of the golden fleece, but it is the cunning of Medea, not the bumbling brutishness of Jason, that wins the prize. Jason is a hero, but not like, say, Achilles in Homer's The Iliad. And no epic would have told a love story. This, in turn, was entertainment. Now, Menander was the greatest writer of new comedy. His Curmudgeon is the only surviving complete play. It is intricate, verbally adroit, and very funny. Now, it treats ordinary domestic concerns, the stuff of daily life, sort of a I Love Lucy Hellenistic style. Now, new and long influential philosophies also arose. The greatest of these, Stoicism and Epicureanism, may be called therapeutic philosophies. Classical values seemed to have failed. The world of the citizen had vanished. Alienation was common, and the focus shifted to ethics. How to live seemed more important than how to know or what to know. So instead of our philosophies focusing on thought and being, like the early philosophers have, we're starting to focus on ethics and understanding how it's important to live rather than what to know. Now, Stoicism rose with Zeno, who lived around 335 to 263 BCE, who taught at the Painted Porch, or the Stoa Poikile, in Athens. Now, he believed that knowledge was possible, and he equated knowledge with virtue. He believed that there was a divine reason that permeated all creation. Virtue consisted in becoming acquainted with this divine reason, in learning its laws, and in putting oneself into harmony with the reason. Natural law philosophy would later derive from this way of thinking as we get towards the end of this class. Now, one has then a moral duty, according to Zeno, to learn the laws of nature and to live in accord with them, and to do so would bring happiness to individuals and justice to societies. Pain or distress in life, and even death, are not absolute or final evils. They can be overcome by apathy, which does not mean I don't care, but instead means I am beyond all pain. Now, suicide is permitted as, curiously, a form of happiness should pain become too great. Stoicism taught that all visible differences in the world are accidental and of no fundamental significance. The king and the slave are essentially alike. Stoicism had a very deep influence on Roman and Christian writers in the centuries to follow. Epicureans, that was Stoicism. Epicureanism takes its name from Epicurus, who lived around 341 to 271 BCE. Now, he also taught in Athens. The aim of philosophy for Epicureans was happiness or pleasure. But this does not mean the hedonism that it often nowadays and quite wrongly associated with Epicureanism. Happiness was defined by Epicurus as an absence of pain from the body and trouble from the soul. Now, this philosophy was austere in the extreme. Pleasure was equated with renunciation. Now, Epicurus urged withdrawal from the world, avoidance of stress and avoidance of extremes. Pain is occasioned by unfulfilled desire. Therefore, it is sensible to desire only things that are easily obtained. And the events of life are accidental, and death is merely dissolution of the chance combination of atoms that made us in the first place. Now, conditions of life are not to be regretted, and death is not to be feared. Now, Rome conquered this Hellenistic world, but its culture conquered the Romans. For several centuries, Roman imperialism locked Hellenistic cultures into place and stamped it deeply on all the cultures that would follow the Romans. Now, next week when we meet again, when I give these lectures again, we'll be talking about the development of ancient Rome and the development of the Roman Republic, followed by the Roman Empire. I hope you enjoyed this lecture on ancient Greece, and I look forward to teaching you more about this specific topic. Have a great week, and I will see you next time.